Hi, and welcome to the show, where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Lauren Umstattd. She is a facial plastic surgery fellow, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, Advice to a Pregnant Surgical Resident. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Poe. I'm so excited to be here today.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and your journey to where you are today?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a fellow right now. I did a surgical residency in ENT at the University of Missouri, and then I decided to do a one-year fellowship in facial plastic surgery. So I'm currently in Memphis, Tennessee, and once I'm done, I'm actually going to open my own practice in Kansas City. So it's been kind of a whirlwind of a year planning to open my own practice, but it's been really exciting and lots of good things happening.
All right, so tell me some of the challenges, facial plastic surgery faces going forward. I don't have a lot of facial plastic surgery fellows on my show, so tell me some of the challenges in your specific field, and maybe you could talk about some of the challenges about opening up your own practice eventually as well.
I think the biggest challenge is really understanding what the patient wants. My fellowship is primarily cosmetic, and my practice will also be cosmetic. And it's just a different take on medicine, right? There's no gold guidelines or infectious disease recommendations on what to prescribe. It's really about you and the patient understanding what they want, what their goals are, and then you as a physician and surgeon describing to them, what that process entails, if their expectations are realistic, and then really deciding if they're the right patient for you and if you're the right provider for them. Because certainly nobody needs any of the procedures that I do, and that's the great part about it. It's all elective, and so it provides, a unique surgeon-patient relationship.
And then eventually, when you do open your own practice, is it in a highly competitive market? Now, what are some of the thought points that go through that decision of opening your own practice?
That's a good question. There's a lot of thought points. So I would say it is a competitive market in certain components. So, for example, Botox and filler are so common to be offered by really anybody these days. And a lot of patients don't really understand the risks that go along with certain fillers. There have been reports of people going blind after getting filler. And I think, as a physician and a surgeon who's trained for, 6 years after medical school, you just have a unique view of the anatomy and kind of how injecting something, how it will, affect the patient, both in the short term and the long term. So I think one of the bigger challenges is just educating patients, and in kind of a non-mean way. I certainly don't want to put down anybody who does any of these procedures, and certainly there are people out there who are educated differently than I am that are very good, and they have a lot more experience than I do at this point. So I never want to make anybody feel bad or, say that, one provider is better than another, but I just think it's important for patients to understand the background of their provider and really the risks involved. You hear about like people going to these parties and just signing up for Botox and filler, and it makes me wonder. I mean, it's a procedure. There are risks involved, and I just wonder if people really know about all of those before they indulge.
Well, best wishes on finishing up fellowship and opening up your practice soon. So let's transition now into your Kevin MD article, and it's titled Advice to a Pregnant Surgical Resident. Now, for those who didn't read the article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
So I wrote this article about a month or about a year after I gave birth to my son. I gave birth during my 4th year of ENT residency, probably one of the busier years of our residency. And I wrote the article really to hopefully provide a voice to female residents who are in a similar situation. When I was pregnant and during the postpartum period, I felt, I don't want to say embarrassed. It's hard for me to find the right word, but I didn't want the department to think that I wasn't showing up at work at 100%. I didn't want the patients to think that either, because I was totally committed to my training, the department, the patients. But I had this weird sense that I had done something wrong, or that, they wouldn't look at me the same now that I had this new role as a mother. And so the article talks about just some of the challenges that I faced, both being pregnant during residency with the long hours, taking call, being on your feet all day, really not getting much of a break, especially in those last couple months of pregnancy when your body is kind of pushed to the limit, as well as some of the challenges I had in the postpartum period, coming back to work so early. I came back after 3 weeks. And then the challenges logistically of, breast pump, like during clinic, and just trying to fit all that in. And so the article is kind of, 3 points that I wanted to convey to trainees. The first is, my first point was being autocratic in your decision to start a family. When I talk to pre-medical students or medical students or other residents, they're like, well, when's the best time to have a child? And my answer is always when you and your partner are ready. Like, I really can't stand that question, but it was also my question. And there's no good time. There's no perfect time. The perfect time is when you and your partner are ready, because they're arguably going to be, the biggest help during all of it. So I just don't think the question should start with, well, when's the best time, and then work backwards in terms of an academic timeline. My next point was to have a flexible plan. Residency is challenging in multiple ways. One being that you really don't have a whole lot of control of your schedule. So being intentional about discussions with your department, your program director, your other residents. My plan was to take more call towards the beginning of my pregnancy so that I didn't miss any call that entire academic year, even though I took 3 weeks off. So being intentional about planning things, having, you hear it from moms and working dads all the time, having a backup to a backup to a backup for childcare, because you just can't call into work when your babysitter cancels. And then the third point was to not apologize. You are an adult female, and it's totally your right to have a child whenever you want to, whether it's in medical school or residency or fellowship. I don't know if it was necessarily because I was in a surgical residency, but the culture in surgery sometimes at some institutions is to be strong and to not ask for a break, work all day, I don't need to eat kind of thing. And I still remember the first time I had to tell my chair that I was pregnant, I was like kind of syncopal. And I just kept apologizing. I was like, sorry, sir, I'm so sorry. I just need to sit down. I feel really lightheaded. At the end of the day, when I got home, I'm like, why am I apologizing? Like, physiologically, my blood volume is expanding. I'm really hot in the operating room. I should have just said, I just need to sit down. And I think you just don't need to apologize for having a child during residency.
Well, I can't imagine how challenging it was, certainly, to be pregnant, especially during an otolaryngology residency. Now, during those few months, how supportive was the program? Not just the program itself, but your colleagues and peers as well.
I had a great residency program. I really look up to all of my attendings that I worked with and my co-residents. No one was not supportive, but they just didn't really say anything, And again, going back to the culture of residency and surgery, I wasn't going to say anything either. So, like, if I felt horrible during a 6-hour parotidectomy, I just felt horrible. Like, I wasn't going to ask to sit down, and my boss wasn't going to say, hey, why don't you take like a 5-minute break? I'm cool for a while. So I just think that, from a trainee perspective, it's good to speak up. But that anyone listening who does have trainees, it's okay to say, like, hey, are you feeling okay? Or, hey, why don't you just take a 5-minute break? I'm good for a bit. Or, you don't need to see the next clinic patient. Why don't you go get a snack? Or, without being patronizing, there are ways that you can hint at the fact that you recognize they're pregnant. It's not an easy process, gaining all that weight with the child, and your body goes through a lot of change. And so, there are ways that the department can really help residents through that process of being pregnant.
And as you were going through your pregnancy, there's certainly no playbook for this. Now, where did you turn to guidance, mentorship, or just simply more information in people who were going through the same experiences as you were?
So I did have some female faculty that I worked with. There was only one of them who had had a child during residency, and she took like 3 days off
Mm,
after she gave birth. And so my other attendings had given birth after they were done with training, and so had a little bit longer, had more control over their schedule when they were pregnant, and then also more control over the postpartum time off. So honestly, I felt a little bit alone
mhm.
during the process. I didn't have like a great female mentor or a male mentor that really walked me through the process and how to speak up for myself, which is why I felt the need to write the article.
We're talking to Lauren Umstattd. She is a facial plastic surgery fellow. She wrote the Kevin MD article, Advice to a Pregnant Surgical Resident. Now, after going through this experience, anything that you wish you had done differently, or anything that you know now that you wish you knew back before you wrote the story?
I think just being more open, with my colleagues and my bosses during training, just telling them, I just don't feel great right now. I'm just going to take a 5-minute break, drink some water.
Hmm.
No one would have faulted me for that, but for some reason I was nervous to do so.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I think looking back, I just would have been more vocal and open. I also would have had a lengthier discussion with my program director about time off after I'd given birth. Our departmental policy at the time said that each new parent will be granted 3 days of maternity or paternity leave. Additional time would be taken from available vacation.
Hmm.
We had 3 weeks of vacation allotted per year. So when I told him I was pregnant, I said, I'll just be taking my 3 weeks of vacation starting the day I go into the hospital to deliver. And he said, okay. And again, I don't fault him for that. I just don't think neither of us really opened up to the idea that maybe there was a better way to do it. Maybe we could have gotten creative and borrowed vacation time from another year or
Hmm.
something. I just wish that I would have been more open to discussing things with him.
For those residency directors who may be listening to you and your story, you did mention that you wish that perhaps more people could just ask you, how are you doing? Are you feeling okay? Structurally, what are some ways that residency programs can change to better accommodate expectant mothers during residency?
I think the first is through policy. Every department has a policy handbook. I had read that thing front to back, and I knew exactly how the department felt about me getting pregnant. I mean, it said it in black and white that I get 3 days off. Like, to
Mm,
me, that basically told me, like, don't get pregnant,
mhm,
even though nobody ever said that.
mhm,
I still, again, going back to my first point in my article, I wanted to be autocratic in deciding when to start my family. And so me and my
mhm,
husband decided to. So I think the first is the policy. If anyone in your program is thinking about having a child, we're all readers and researchers. And so we're going to go look at the handbook. And so I think having a decent policy written down, but then I also think as a program director, you have to be flexible with, no one pregnancy or adoption or, if it's a father who's going to become a new dad, no one trainee is going to have the same experience. What if a trainee goes on bed rest? What happens to their academic schedule? Are they going to have to delay their graduation? So I think just being open and having scheduled discussions, schedule a meeting, 15-minute meeting, 3 times during their pregnancy just to check in and give
mhm.
dedicated time to your schedule so it doesn't keep getting pushed back. And not necessarily having the discussions in the open, because I think a lot of women don't want to admit, like, oh, I don't feel great today.
Mhm.
So, it's sometimes it's not the most appropriate time to ask them in the middle of a surgery, like, how are they doing? One, you're concentrating on what you're
Mhm.
doing. And two, there's a lot of other people in the room that you may not feel as comfortable around. So I think, having those conversations, in the hallway or in your office or something, it would give it more structure, if it was an intentional meeting, just to check in,
Mhm.
ask if there's anything they can do. And then from a colleague standpoint, from a co-resident standpoint, again, just checking in, just asking them is the biggest thing, just to just so they recognize that you see them, you see the the challenges that they're going through, and that you're there for them if they need anything.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
The biggest thing is that you have to be your own advocate. No one else is going to advocate for you like you. Whether it's advocating for better maternity leave in your program, whether it's becoming involved in the house staff organization as a trainee and implementing a new paging system at your hospital, whatever it may be, just defining what you're passionate about, what you think could be better done, talking to other people, and then advocating for your change, because that's the way that we're all going to get better together.
Lauren, thank you so much for sharing your story and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you so much.